All right, about once a quarter, I got to deal with this because someone listened to someone who didn't know what the fuck they're talking about instead of listening to people that do. And I'm one of those people that actually do know what the fuck I'm talking about. I may not have a big flashy show on Fox, but goddamn it, I went to a lot of fucking school for this stuff, and I actually have done it in my actual life. So when you look at the U.S. debt, which is generally U.S. Treasury bonds, there's about $32 trillion in debt. Of that $32 trillion, $7 trillion is what's called intergovernmental holdings. The majority of that is we borrowed against Social Security, so the U.S. government owes itself to pay back Social Security that is for us, us taxpayers who paid into Social Security. That leaves about $25 trillion of the debt that is held by the public. Just anyone who can have it. Me, you, foreign governments, banks, companies, whoever wants to buy U.S. Treasury bonds can buy them, and that's the debt held by the public, and that totals about $25 trillion. So let's break that down. Already you can see that 3/4 of the debt is public, 1/4 is private. So 25% of the U.S. debt is intergovernmental, held by the U.S. So when you go look at that $25 trillion, about $8 trillion is foreign debt. That means $17 trillion is domestic. That means companies like banks or your IRA or the thrift savings plan, which a lot of us government workers invest in, or certain companies, they hold treasury bonds. Of that $25 trillion that is U.S. debt, that is for the public, $17 trillion is held by U.S. companies, U.S. citizens, U.S. banks, the U.S. So that leaves roughly $8 trillion for foreign entities. And this came out in the December 2022 Treasury Bulletin. Every quarter the Treasury publishes these. This is public knowledge. This is not some fucking wizardry I'm doing here. So $8 trillion is foreign. Who holds the most of that? Well, according to the U.S. Treasury Bulletin of 2022, the largest owner of U.S. debt is Japan. Of the $8 trillion, they own $1.08 trillion in U.S. Treasury bonds. That was as of November 22nd. The second largest is China, who owns $870 billion in U.S. Treasury bonds. So no, China doesn't own us, not even close. That is by design. Again, I tell people you don't become the most powerful economy in the history of the world without knowing what the fuck you're doing. Also, there's this misconception that China can just say, hey, US, pay us your debt. Well, you know what? That's not the agreement when it comes to a treasury bond. There's actually a yield over time. That's why there's a 30-year bond or a 20-year bond or whatever. Many dates, and that date is agreed upon. And when that date hits, that maturity date, that's when you get paid back your money plus interest. The U.S. has never defaulted on that ever. And it likely won't unless the government is stupid and decides not to pay its debts. But that's political. That's outside of my realm. So here's why China won't do that. First and foremost, if you want to dump your treasury bonds, you have to put them on the open market. So what's happened essentially is you bought treasury bonds likely in a lower inflationary period, held on to them through inflation, and then at the end of that inflation decide, I'm going to go ahead and sell them, but I'm not going to reap the interest benefit. So then you're just basically flushing money down the toilet. China's not stupid. They're not going to do that. Also, China and Japan both value a dollar that is higher than the value of their own currency. Why? Because Japan and China are export-driven nations, and it keeps the exports to the U.S. affordable. That means that if they dump treasury bonds and the U.S. dollar starts to tank and the yuan or the yen is below or starts to rise above, the higher the rate is, the exchange rate of yen to dollar, the more likely it's going to cost more for the U.S. consumer to buy something, so they won't buy Chinese products. Supply and demand. When things cost more, people buy less of them. That hurts the Chinese economy, so they won't do that. It was only in 2006 when China replaced the United Kingdom as the largest holder of U.S. Treasury bonds or U.S. debt, with the U.K. being the third largest holder now. So wherever you're hearing this notion that the U.S. debt is all owned by China, or that it's owned by a combination of Japan and China. That's wrong. When in fact, over 80%, what is that? 8 divided by, so yeah, 1/4. 1/4, so 75% of the US debt is owned by US entities, the US government, US citizens, US companies, period. This is all plain as day, black and white. And I figure I'm going to have to explain it again to someone new in a couple months.